All right, friends, today we are going to pick up where we left off after the first great story. So I want us to think back to our story about how the earth came to be. And remember how at the very beginning the earth started out as just this kind of fiery mass of energy and heat and light. And it was very, very hot, and it was kind of just chaotic. And in order for the earth to become what it is today, it had to follow some laws. And we had the three different substances and the three different types of particles that would follow their laws. That when they were heated, they would rise. When they cooled, they would fall. And that dance started going on, heating and cooling, rising and falling. And as those particles heated and cooled and rose and fell, they would eventually fall according to their weight. And the heaviest substances kind of came to the center of the earth. And then the lighter substances formed our crust, that is the ground that we eventually walk on. And the lightest substances, those gases, would form our atmosphere around the earth. And remember how as the earth had a very thin crust on it to start with, there was still a lot of heat and energy inside the earth. And we know that substances that are hot, they had to follow their laws, and they expanded, but they expanded out, and all these volcanoes were erupting all over the surface of the earth, and they created that big cloud of ash, and it was so ashy that the sun couldn't shine down on the earth for a really long time. But then as the earth eventually cooled and the ash started to dissipate, all of the vapor that was rising up into the atmosphere, as it cooled and it fell back down to earth, it could actually fall as rain, and it could stay on the surface, because the surface of earth had cooled enough to actually hold water. And so our oceans began to form. And that's where we left off. So today we're going to start there, and I'm going to tell it in kind of a dramatic story. There are going to be different elements: the sun, the earth, the water, the air, and I'm going to make them kind of take on lives of their own, and I'm going to make them become characters in our story. So I know that they didn't really talk to each other, but it kind of helps us understand our next part. Okay, so thinking about all of the water that was eventually filling all the hollows on Earth's surface. And we had all these oceans, but we still didn't have any form of life yet. We still only had our four main elements: the land, the water, air, and the sun. And for a while, they were all working together really, really well. And it seemed like order had come to Earth. But at some point, the sun, looking down on the ocean, started to notice a problem. Because you see, even though the order had brought all of these elements together, there was a little bit of disorder that was starting to happen. Remember how we had that big cloud of ash that was kind of surrounding the earth? Well, when it had finally began clearing and rain could actually start falling, there was still a little bit of ash in the air. And so the water mixed with the ash and formed a weak acid. And when the acid fell down onto the rocks and the land, it kind of broke it away and started to erode it. And all of that erosion and those little pieces of rocks would go into the ocean. So the ocean was filling up with a lot of minerals and salts. And then the oceans were really, really wild and crazy at that time. And so there were a whole bunch of storms that were happening, and all of the water was hitting against the rocks and the land. And with that happening over years and years and years, the land was starting to erode that way as well. And more of it was getting washed into the ocean. And so we were losing our landform. And there was beginning to be an imbalance. There were too many salts and minerals that were kind of starting to fill our oceans. And the sun noticed this, and so the sun was watching, and it decided to go investigate. And because the salts were in the water, the sun decided to go talk to the water first. And the sun said, "Water, what's going on? Why are you so full of salts and minerals?" And you know what? Water was a little bit offended, and water said, "Excuse me, I can't help it that I'm full of salts and minerals. I am simply following my laws. When I am heated, I rise. When I am cooled, I fall. And I just fill the hollows and the surfaces of earth. That's all I'm doing. If you want to really figure out what's wrong, you need to go talk to air, because air is the reason I get all moved up and I'm heating and I'm rising and then I fall in my new places. So you need to go talk to air. So the sun decided to go talk to air. And the sun went to air and asked, Air, what's happening? Why do we have this problem in the water? And air was also a little bit offended. Air said, What? I'm sorry. Water told you that? Water told you to come talk to me? Phew, water. Let's talk about water. I'm doing my job. My job is to cover and create blankets across the surface of Earth, but Earth is very vast, and I'm constantly trying to move and be in all places at once. And water just jumps along for the ride. When I am heated and I'm going over hot rocks, I have to get out of the way. They're too hot. So of course I start traveling up. But then when I get really cold, I cringe and water gets really heavy and I have to drop water. So it's not my fault. If you really want to know who you should talk to, you should go talk to the rocks. They're the reason that I have to rise in the first place, because they get too hot. And they're the reason I have to drop water when I get too cold. You really need to go talk to the rocks. So the sun went, and the sun decided to go and talk to the rocks. And it said, Rocks, land, what is the problem? Why are you washing away? Why is the water so full of all these salts and minerals? It's a problem. And what do you think the rocks felt? They were also offended, and they said, Sun, excuse me, what? All I do is sit. I sit here, I don't get to move, and you shine down on me. So I'm sorry that the air rises when I get too hot and it has to drop water, but I'm not doing anything. I stay in one spot. Sun, if you really want to know who's to blame, it's you. You shine down on me all day long. You make me hot. So if you want to know who the problem is, it's actually you. And so all this blaming went round and round and round and round. And you know what the actual problem was? It's not that it was just one of the four elements. It's that all of the elements were working together and they were all following their laws. But even with them all following their laws, there was still disorder. There was still balance, and not one element was to blame. And this means that another element had to come to Earth in order to bring back the order, in order to make life, or to make Earth balanced again. And that one element that had to come was life. And because the problem was in the salt water, was because the problem was in the water, and the water was overly salty, way more salty than it is today in our oceans, that's where the life had to begin. It had to begin in the water because that's where the problem was. And this first bit of life, it wasn't humans. Humans weren't just, boom, we're here. It was a very, very small, tiny speck of life. And we can imagine it to kind of be like a tiny drop of jelly right in the oceans. And life had its own laws that it had to follow. And one of them is that it would grow. And so it had to eat, right? In order to grow, we have to eat. And so that tiny little speck of jelly ate what was available to it. And so it ate the salts and the minerals in the ocean. And eventually, as some of these life forms began to experiment and change, some of them would use those salts and minerals to create shells that would be on their backs, right? But another law that life follows is that life does not live forever. It will eventually die. And so in order to continue their work and to continue balance on Earth, those life forms, they have to make more of themselves. They have to reproduce. And so as they reproduced and there were more and more and more, the oceans, and they were eating all of the salts and the minerals, the oceans eventually became balanced again. They came back to a place of order. And the animals that were eating those salts and minerals, the ones that had them on their backs, those shells, when those animals died or creatures died, those shells would eventually fall off. And those shells would kind of disintegrate into a layer of silt on the ocean floor, and then another layer of silt on the ocean floor, and another layer on the ocean floor. And so we don't know a ton about life at the very beginning of Earth, but we do have all of these layers upon layers upon layers on the bottom of our ocean floor, and those kind of act as our books in a story, or as our pages in a story, and they kind of give us hints about the first life forms on Earth. Is the timeline of life. And you get some time to just kind of explore the timeline a little bit and look at how, from the very first speck of jelly that we had in our oceans, how it had to experiment and change and grow and develop into all these different types of life forms that we would eventually have before the Earth was ready for humans. Have fun.